Okay, good afternoon. It's really an honor to be here with one of my favorite writers, Mr. Alfred Krip Yuson. How are you today?
Hello, Muki. Good afternoon.
Hi, we've known each other a very, very long time.
Quite, yeah. We go back some ways.
Have I known you for 20 years? Not yet.
Maybe.
Maybe 20 years?
I remember you were a professional student in Ateneo.
A professional
student. So you still caught me
when
in
I
my
was 5.
teaching days. One of my first poetry students, in fact. I think you were in the first poetry class.
In the first batch, along with writers like Naya Valdeon, Mikael Ko. Did you teach Mikael Ko?
No, not Mikael. No, neither Paderna, neither Pichi. It's you and Naya whom I remember most. There was another guy who was quite good at that time. Parang 3 of you were outstanding in the class.
Maybe Larry Ipil, no? He's higher than me.
No, he's older, di ba?
He's a bit older.
Yeah.
Before we launch into our interview proper, I would like to introduce you, your professional career to our audience by telling them your background in writing as well as the canonical texts that you've authored. So, Sir Alfred Yuson has authored 30 books to date, including novels, poetry collections, short fiction, essays, children's stories, biographies, and coffee table books. That's a lot of writing. Yeah. Apart from having edited various other titles, including several literary anthologies, and I'll make mention of them later on. Like I mentioned, they are canonical texts and are probably some of the best examples of Filipino literature. Not probably, surely. He has gained numerous distinctions, including the 2009 Gawad Pambansang Alagad ni Balagtas from Umpil, or the Writers' Union of the Philippines, the Patnubay ng Sining at Kalinangan Stalwart of Art and Culture Award from the City of Manila, a Rockefeller Foundation grant for residency at the Bellagio Study and Conference Center in Italy, and the C. Wright Award from Thai Royalty for Lifetime Achievement. He has also been elevated to the Hall of Fame for the Carlos Palanca Awards for Literature, and he has enjoyed various and many literary, not just festivals, but also literary residencies abroad. Which one has been your favorite residency?
Oh, that's hard to say. Everything that you've said so far only point to the fact that I'm quite ancient.
You're not ancient.
So parang the memory is toggled often, no? But when you speak of the international poetry readings, festivals, which one? Probably the one in South Africa.
This was fairly recent?
About a little less than a decade ago, siguro mga 8 years ago.
Okay. Why was it particularly special?
It transpired over 5 or 6 days at the University of Kuala Lumpur or something like that. No? And the page poets like me, that's what they called us, the oldies, who read from books, or manuscripts, were merged with the griots.
What are the griots?
The griots are were open mic poetry type of people, or not quite rappers, but something like that, performance poets who read from memory, or recited from memory rather. No? They were the young guys, mostly blacks. And some sort of osmosis came to be in the 4 or 5 days. By the last day, the last poem I read, I was already reading from my cell phone, the way they did.
Millennial.
And trying to adopt to the rhythms or assume the rhythms that they had. Parang spoken word, etc. and all that. And I just made that poem an hour before the reading.
Oh, wow.
So, parang we also got to prove that there was no separation or bifurcation between so-called page poets and oral poetry. And they also acknowledged that they learned from us. How to adopt some facets of so-called page poetry into their own rhythms, which are made up of long lines, etc.
By us, you mean the oral poets there learned from the poets who actually...
That's right. So there was a transfer.
Well, that's good.
That's
what poetry should be.
You were in Medellin, no?
Yes.
That of course was enjoyable. because
Very
of
enjoyable.
the crowd size, you know, in that wonderful amphitheater where you have about 3,000 to 5,000
people.
And they sit in the rain. You know. That's wonderful. Nicaragua also. What was that? Not Managua. What do you call that? Granada. Granada. And then there was one memorable conference or festival in Finland, in Mukula off Helsinki, which transpired in the week of the morning sun, they call it, the midnight sun, midsummer festival. It was quite a group, probably coming from about 20, 25 countries. I think I was one of 2 Asians. That was also riotous because it all ended up with drinking every night. And the sun never went under the horizon, so you have daytime.
You're awake at 3 in the morning, the sun is up at 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning.
And one highlight was they had a football game where the Finnish poets were pitted against what I got to call, and they adopted it as the RTW squad. I was part of it. That's rest of the world. Timothy Mo was our star football player.
Okay.
Because he knew how to show his butt to the crowd.
Was it a nice butt? Was it worth it?
I wasn't looking. It was may kagampi. So there's madami. There were some in Australia, in Sydney, where the poets, where we had our readings in the grounds of the parang National Mental Hospital. So it was said that people couldn't tell which were the poets and which were the residents.
So it appears that we really have a culture of, being on the international arena already. I think that Filipino poets, especially in recent years, are really gaining international, if not acclaim, international. I mean, we are, the international community is aware of us.
It helps, of course, that the language that's mostly used by those who are invited abroad is English, of course. Like if there are festivals in Singapore or Malaysia or Indonesia, most of those who are invited are the ones who practice in English. Unfortunately for the Filipino writers. No?
Right.
One other major factor is, of course, typically Filipino generosity in terms of sharing, in a way, these grants serially. Like whenever I'm invited to a new one, I try to convince the organizers, okay, next year you get this guy. Or they usually ask you naman, they
to
ask
recommend somebody.
To recommend someone. So it's passed on like a daisy chain. That's how it happened with Medellin.
Yes.
I recall one other, I think a festival that you attended recently was the one in Rotterdam. That was also very memorable. That was memorable.
Memorable for me too.
In terms of the crowd and the appreciation.
Right.
And the coffee shops.
But for me, nothing compares to Medellin. Because in Medellin, in Colombia, poets are rock stars. So there's really this huge appreciation. And I heard it's because poetry was somehow used to deal with their drug problem. Maybe we can learn from the experience of the people in Medellin.
It's also part of liberation theology.
Yes.
In a way.
Well, I'm sure a lot of people are curious about you as a writer. Do you have any rituals when you begin writing? I know some writers sharpen pencils or light candles or open a drawer full of green apples and
not anymore.
Smell them.
You probably do that in your teens or early 20s.
Okay.
But after all the experience and the variety of writing that I've done professionally, parang anytime. It used to be that I couldn't write until late at night or early morning, the wee hours. For one thing, I'm a late sleeper, so you can never do any writing in the morning. But these days, when I do find myself somewhere, especially abroad, when you have to hew to a schedule and you have to wake up in time for breakfast, I find that I can write any old time as long as the urge is there.
Okay.
And most of the writing that people like me and Butch Dalisay, my good friend, do are commitments. So we've been trained, yung professionally to adhere to deadlines,
right.
you know. So you can write anytime. You should write anytime.
Anytime.
But that also goes with poetry or fiction. Of course, that depends more on the inspiration and the urge to do a particular piece.
Okay. So can you...
Yeah, it used to be that when you were a teenager, we would write on the backs of cigarette cartons, or ganyan, or like Ricky de Ungra used to collect in his verses on the palara.
Yeah.
Well, that was well before laptops and now
cell phones.
Now you can do. I do a lot of my writing during traffic.
Right.
You know, because I'm driven around and I write at the back. I use my cell phone to do notes or poems, actual poems I've written.
Can you actually, I know that when you have writing deadlines, as I've had writing deadlines for, let's say, magazines or blogs, can you apply that same discipline? Because you really have to work with a deadline. I mean, it's really, really a discipline, a nightly discipline that you do. And that can be trained. That part of your brain can be trained. But your poetic brain can't really be trained with the same rigor and discipline.
The deadline doesn't come into the horizon. You know? But it helps that you've always been, in a way, parang your arm is always flexed. Parang you're trained to write daily. To produce something every day. The challenge becomes, in fact, which particular project to put in the to put closer to you in the fire. No? Parang which particular burner. You've got we're working on 3 or 4
at
things.
any given time.
Yeah, so it's a matter of prioritizing. And then during the windows of opportunity when you are not writing commissioned work, that's when the poetry and the fiction can come in.
Do you feel like deadlines also feed your creative energy so that...
Yeah, you like the pressure after a while. It's like being a trained athlete, or your muscle memory is there.
Right.
So
I agree.
even if you're sick or, or not feeling too well, or bedridden, you can write. You have to.
What happens if you have nothing to write?
There always is something to write on. It's either the commissioned work or when the open time comes, that's the writing that you do for yourself.
Let's say, I'm sure a lot of our young writers would know what they can do. And I get asked this question a lot. What do writers do when they experience writer's block?
No such thing.
I agree.
No such thing. That's a conceit.
I always get asked that question by young writers everywhere I go.
Of course, it happens to writers, as they're not that trained yet, and it's more of a psychological crutch. It's an excuse. I have writer's block. No such thing.
Do you believe that you write even when you're not writing?
Yeah, you do. You're doing research, or when you're observing people in a social situation, or again, if you're stuck on traffic, you begin to try to conceive of certain, plots or storylines or threads of poetry.
Related to that, what would you say is a favorite work of yours that you've written?
It's hard to say. Having many children, can't really. Well, because there's poetry, there's fiction, there's...
So let's go to essays. Poetry. Do you have a favorite collection of yours?
Not a particular collection of the 6 or 7 I put out, but yeah, probably a few favorite poems. The Father comes to mind initially because it was, psychologically, it was very fulfilling. I wrote it when I was in Iowa. And my dad had passed away about a year before. And I had been trying to write a tribute to him for a good year. And it all wound up in the trash can. But there was that night, on my first week in Iowa, I was alone in the apartment. And I sort of felt a presence in the room. In the corner. I remember I was even telling myself, talking to him, I said, come on, did you have to follow me all the way here? Something like that. No? We had our conflicts. he became a very religious man, so that was the root of the conflict. In any case, that night, I remember there was a presence in the corner, and then I couldn't sleep, and the first line came to mind.
Which poem was this?
Yung Father. How does it start?
Is this the one where you thump a child's blow on his chest? That's a beautiful poem. That's one of my favorite poems.
When he was in the hospital. The first, second, third line came. By the second or third stanza, I said, "Oh, I'm gonna forget all of this. I can't." So I had to stand up and go to the next room where my big typewriter was and started writing, and it just came. The whole thing came, automatic writing. And I'm very proud of it because the poem not only is emotionally fulfilling, it expresses everything I wanted to say, but craft-wise,
it's very organic.
Technically, it's all there. The rhythms, the rhymes, the internal rhymes.
So there were no other
when I woke up the next morning, no revision. So one of the first instances, or a few instances of automatic writing. There are other.
Are your best poems like that, or do some poems that you consider some of your best rely on heavy editing or revision?
Some poems actually take years to write, or some you even rediscover after a decade that you've kept a little fragment. Or some poems are failed poems. You probably finish it, but you don't publish them. You don't quite think that they're of the quality for publication. Or sometimes you just salvage a few lines. When it's a failed poem by itself, integrally it's a failed poem. You just save 2 or 3 good lines that you can use in another idea.
Right.
So some poems take time, but some usually, you like to. I make it a point to make it what you call boro. When you've done it, you go through it the next day, apply a little revision. When you think that it's fulfilled, okay, done. You file it, but you keep it and go back to it after a week or a month or 2. Only then you say, okay, nothing more to add or subtract. So that's a finished poem. So it depends on the poem. Some are easy, some take very long.
I agree. But I think the rule really is the poems that come immediately to you and I know this of other writers as well, are usually the ones that are more visceral and more successful.
Especially if they're of the emotional or psychological sort. Surprisingly, there are certain poems that I found very easy to write, especially in the earlier days, that I didn't think much of. But there are certain poems, especially when you do a collection, when you write a book, it's not so much that you're padding it, but you know that some poems have to be there.
Right.
Even if you're not so proud of them as the others.
They have fillers.
Fillers because they are part of that cycle of your creativity then. If it represents 2 years or 5 years, ganyan. But like there are poems na, I remember Mom Edith, one of her favorite poems of mine was Afternoon Gardener, which I didn't think much of. I really thought it was nothing. Parang just throwaway poem.
Right.
But she kept quoting the lines, and even in one of her books where she wrote a long critique, she kept pointing to that poem as something or other. You get struck.
Metaphysical.
But that happens all the time.
Journey.
You don't always agree with about your favorite poems and the ones that your readers appreciate more than you do.
No, absolutely.
It happens all the time.
It's I remember because one of my favorite composers, Stephen Sondheim, the same thing happened to him, where a lot of his commercial work to him is really not that good, and his favorite work of his was a very obscure musical that nobody liked watching, that only a few people had actually heard of. But that was the work that he actually connected to. It was Pacific Overtures. Anyway, so if you were to enter the minds of literary critics, how do you think they would view your work? How would they size you up?
I don't really know. I can only
say. Do we have any good literary critics whose judgment you would trust?
Well, Mom Edith, I always respected, because she was always very cerebral in her critiquing.
Right.
And she always operated from a very high viewpoint.
Right.
That wasn't really focused entirely or specifically on a particular writer, but certain ideas that she has about poetic structure or certain conceits for poetry or fiction, and then she applies it to certain writers or poets. So she doesn't start with the poet himself or herself. It's really based on the ideas that she's germinating. So I'd put her as one of our
finest literary minds.
Deep and astute, no? Ofi de Malanta, also, I appreciated her for her, parang she had the nose for good writing. The articulation might not have been as deep, or so it seemed, as Ma'am Edith, no? But she had that she had good hunches with regards good writing and not so good writing. Like people like them, because in their seniority, are often asked to write blurbs or intros,
right?
And you can sense right away which one she just did because
you were her friend,
and the ones where she really gushes.
Right.
Cesar Sijuco used to be a very good literary critic, as well as more of a good literary critic than an art critic, actually. But that was a long time ago. He hasn't really written book reviews. The kind of literary scholarship that my good friend Jimmy Abad does is of a different sort. It's more of a anthologizing, and documenting the produce of generations of either poets or fictionists. That's a different kind of annotation. But I think there is something in his own personality that hinders him from applying pure critique to anyone's work, because he doesn't want to offend anyone. So
and yet some people have taken offense at his very innocuous kind of scholarship.
The kind of selection he does?
Or his take on post-colonialism, colonialism.
Okay. No, those theories I don't really
Which is very interesting. Do you think that writers should have a good and sound theoretical background in criticism? No?
No.
Because that's one great big debate going on now.
I forgot to mention. I should mention, J. Neil Garcia, of course, should be mentioned as one very, very astute, also, and very deep literary critic.
Yes.
Personally, and we've quarreled many times, I find that he goes that's my view, that he goes overboard,
Right.
Never mind the jargon, never mind that. No, he gets guilty of that, but I can understand his position. But it's the kind of reading sometimes that he tries to foist on any work. The gender sensibility thing,
it's about promoting really your own agenda or your own.
I won't even say that. But I've disputed some of the ways that he takes on a particular work or a particular person, poet, ganyan, on the basis of the gender sensibility. I recall that in the last workshop in Dumaguete, I raised the question, if somebody found this poem without knowing who wrote about it, just found the slip of paper and read it, then you don't know that this was Angela Manalang Gloria or Edith Tiempo. You don't even know if it was female or male, the voice. That's to me is the pure appreciation of the poem.
Right.
Without foisting all this.
Which is to say, to hark back to the idea of literary theory, the author is supposed to be dead in new critical theory.
That I can accept.
But for theorists, not really. The author is not dead, right?
they sometimes, but they tend to supersede the author himself or herself.
Right.
Well, it's their right, of course. It's a different ball game, no, in critiquing. Although early on I was of the school of thought that they were really more of the parasites, no? Parang they don't exist unless the creatives exist for them to work on. I mean, to say something about the work.
Right.
But you take away the poets and the critics, what do they do? You know, the theorists
Well, who will
and the critics.
who will they theorize about?
So I appreciate the efforts. No,
Right.
There are some critics that are.
So we end with J. Neil. Is there anybody, J. Neil Garcia? Is there anybody who comes after him?
Not
that
too
you
many
admire?
people have been doing criticism, local criticism. I'm not too familiar with those on the other side of the language fence, no, in Filipino. I would think that Danny Reyes, someone like Dan Reyes, would make a good critic, hearing the way he assesses works during a workshop. You know, he's very articulate and comes up with the right points. But I'm not familiar with too many of his works. I mean, written works. Parang hindi. I think his time is
Yes, the one
taken up.
book, right? Promising Lights.
But that's poetry.
That's I mean, you mean criticism?
As criticism, yeah. So, wala. Merly Alunan had a few, I think. But currently, parang there's hardly anyone. Danton is more of a reviewer like me. You know, like I don't exercise real critiquing.
Right.
My kind of reviewing is more of to promote the book, you know,
Right.
and to share it with other people, so that they gain familiarity with the work. You know, I've long ambitioned, you know, if I find the time to get into real criticism, but again, there's
Where
that
will you find the
Filipino-
time between the living and the
And there's also that
writing?
fear, that concern rather, yung pagka-Filipino na you don't want to hurt anyone's feelings.
Right.
It's bad enough that my personality is kind of already on the offside, no? Yung parang, but
what
to put it
way?
in writing.
Yeah.
I don't know, like...
I find that more and more the younger generation of writers want to have a more holistic approach to writing, which is here in the Philippines at least, poets are forced to be not just writers but critics as well. So, whereas abroad you have the critics and then you have the poets.
Yeah.
Here, the writers are also critics.
Yeah. Well, schools of thought, no? There are some who would say that specialization is probably the priority. But you better be good at something first before you
Right.
try to
Juggle
tackle
too
many
many
other
balls.
genres. So, but if you can, if you're a literary Da Vinci, fine. I remember a book that impressed me so much. I'm not sure now if the author was Richard Howard. All About America or something like that. And it was, for me, the best individual criticism ever attempted on American poets. And that was 3-4 decades ago. And I had always been ambitioning to do something similar to the Filipino poets I know. It would be a different kind of interpretive reading. Like, I'm familiar with works by Cirilo, no? Ricky, of course, Fred Salanga, Jimmy. So I'll start with them, then sila Marnie, sila Raby, where I try to critique particular poems in relation to what I know of them and their personality and their reading habits and all that. You know, so it would be parang a personalistic kind of reading and appreciation. It's not really a matter of critiquing not negatively, you know, but to try to bring out what I see in their lines, to try to, say my piece on it, which may not be the same as what Ricky had thought of what his poem was about. But in my memory, I sent him mail that he received in St. Louis, and the black postman sort of was kind of mocking him as a Chinese
like stepped on his
guy.
parcel, diba?
So, bring in those things, but the personal memorabilia. Then after that, I also thought of trying to do a book of something similar that would involve only women poets. And I was prepared to include even the ones who wrote in Tagalog, like Elinia Ruth Mabanglo, Becky Año
Benny Santos.
But only the ones that I knew personally, so I can speak of them. We start with Virgin Moreno, siyempre, Edith, Offie, Marge, Merly, Tita Lacambra Ayala, all the way down. But it will take such effort. And I only thought of doing that when there were such things as when I was still competing for grants like the NCCA Writers Prize. Only that way can I get into a project like that, with an incentive in mind.
But wouldn't imposing what you knew about them personally, wouldn't that compromise the integrity of their work?
Parang it's a matter of, it's being a bit of a literary sleuth, ba? Parang I will try to trace na, I think Jimmy Abad wrote about what he calls the glass man, because one time we were having coffee and this thing, parang that's why I was talking about the personalistic side of it. It can be done only with people that you're really quite familiar with, of course. So it'll be very different from critiquing or coming out in appreciation of the works of people who are absolute strangers to you, where the reading will only be done in one way, out of the sheer craft, out of what you read. But most critics, and that is, I think, what also bedevils or hinders some of the criticism, the local criticism, from proceeding apace in international standards, because we all know each other. Most people know one another, and there are the biases and the prejudices, ganyan. So it's hard to apply something the way a British critic would read, say, a first book of poems by somebody from Canada or the US and not know anything about that person and actually go into a literary discussion of the works. That'll be on the purer sort, but had no prejudice to what I was trying to imagine I could do, because might as well use that familiarity to try to not really explain, but to do some detective work on the poems. When like Ricky writes about something, I know what girl he's talking about.
So when do you foresee this project happening? Is this a project that you want to do?
When the NCAA
gives you the
posts a grant money that I can compete for, or I don't know. After all, when there's no more commissioned work, siguro, and I have quite a nest egg, and I'm not too busy with my own creative writing, but it takes time, and that's the kind of project that you do now and then, siguro.
Sporadically, it's not one long effort.
Yeah.
So which of your novels is your favorite? We've handled actually one poem. I just asked you what your favorite collection of poems was, but you mentioned one poem.
Yeah.
But if you had a text that you think younger generations should be acquainted with.
So poetry, so fiction.
Okay, first in general, let's go to the novel.
Well, again, the three children so far. So, of course, the first one, Great Philippine Jungle Energy Cafe, is most memorable. It's firstborn. And the time that I was writing it was quite...
How old were you when you wrote it?
Late 30s to... Late 30s to 40s. It was done over a period of a year and a half. And under all kinds of influence. So
you mean mentorship or
illegal matter of ingesting
currently illegal influences?
Both legal and illegal. Well, I enjoyed the humor. I enjoyed because the other two novels are not as humorous.
Okay, let's talk about the two other novels.
Voyeurs and Savages was written under deadline, and it only came about almost inadvertently. I was busy with the Rene de Villa presidential campaign. And then I pulled an Achilles. I got into a quarrel with his son-in-law, I think, and so I said goodbye to the media camp and just closeted myself at home. And then I learned that there was this Centennial Prize for the novel. I think that was 1998 or something like that. And I had a month to go. Okay. And since I wasn't doing anything, I was just, sulking in my tent. So I tried to finish it, and I managed to in the last minute. What was that? The other one? No, that was Voyeurs and Savages. Yeah. So I wrote it under pressure, and I think it won third, I think, in that contest. Not bad. $250,000.
That's not a bad. That's not a bad price.
But again, I don't know if it's a correct thing to do, but I pride myself in a certain slyness or craftiness.
Are you sure you want to divulge this?
It's okay. That's me. Cleverness by half. Now, like in that book, knowing that the deadline was beating down upon me, I had a lot of excerpts and quotations. I quoted from Ambeto Campo, I quoted from Conrad de Quiros and certain friends, and worked it in among the characters in the novel. Okay. That they were writing emails to one another, and this was part of their correspondence. It was a way of padding up the book, of course, but it's still integral naman to the story. I can't seem to write a straight narrative from A to Z. I always have to make it jump hopscotch across a time frame or places. So flash forward, backstories. Same thing with the third. Novel, which was an expansion of a story, The Music Child. And again, I wrote that specifically for a contest.
Okay.
That seems to have been the incentive. That's my guilty pleasures as well as, I wish I could write more novels. I have a lot of ideas. But given my regimen, parang I'm more, parang mas pwede sa poetry because you can do one in a day, not the long haul exercises.
Do you think the novel is still important in this day and age?
I think so, because there are ways to stir up the novel in certain ways, in different ways. My good friend Savi Aquino has long been announcing that he's writing an anti-novel.
How does that work, though?
Well, mostly mixes up all his memorabilia, his reminiscences, and even
genres,
literary essays, and a matter of working them into the narrative, putting everything together. So it must be thick.
Where in all of this, where would you position the Great Philippine Jungle Energy Cafe?
I thought it brought humor into the horizon.
Because Nick Joaquin called it the best comic novel that he had read. And perhaps would read from a Filipino writer.
For one thing, not so many novels were being done, even then, especially then. So, I think, I appreciate it. I was also humbled.
Which I think should be reading. I mean, both across the country.
Nick and friends whom now, si Nick, I asked for an intro. No, I just asked for permission to quote. He actually reviewed it for the Inquirer. So what came out as an intro was an excerpt from his review. The other one by Francis Eliana was actually commissioned of him by the contest sponsors. He became the official reader.
Okay.
So it was unsolicited.
Because it made a comeback recently. Wasn't there an entire exhibit dedicated to the characters in your book?
Yeah, now that you remind me. Yeah, I suppose it broke a certain grounds in consciousness. Even if you call it just a cult group or what, like, I'm flattered. Jessica Safra says that I wrote something that hardly anyone, I mean, it was too advanced for most readers to understand. On the other hand, I'm very happy with the novel because it drew a lot of critical reaction. And there was a lady professor in UP, I won't name her na lang, she's her spouse is a good friend of mine also, who criticized it nga na
saying what?
I was burlesquing daw Philippine history, na parang sayang lang my talent, why couldn't I have done this and done that?
What do you mean by done this and done that? Did she specify?
It's a different novel you have in mind. Parang I shouldn't have made fun of Rizal or Bonifacio or the other.
Why not?
And I'm happy that someone else, a younger lady professor in UP, took up the cudgels from me and actually wrote a thesis.
Who was this? This was written in the 80s, right?
Something like that, or late 80s now. The criticism
90s.
came out in the 90s already. Ruth Pison was a lady who
brilliant teacher.
Actually argued the points raised by the first lady. Not the first lady, the earlier
lady. Earlier lady.
So, okay lang. And now, I don't know, so old na, I know I don't have much to live pa. Parang, I keep telling myself every time I finish a project, a commission, and I'm soon getting to that point again. I've been just stating something, a fourth novel, and this time I want to write it in, not Filipino, but my Tagalog, Manileño Tagalog. That's how I can write. I cannot compete with those who write in Filipino.
How would this sound?
As I would speak my Tagalog.
How different would that be from Taglish?
It would be different from. It would be a lot Taglish, as against someone who comes from Bulacan or Laguna or sila Teo or sila Bobby.
Which I find really interesting because I remember I was in a writing festival in Macau, and everybody has heard of Singlish. But what the crowd really wanted to hear was Taglish. I don't think, like for them, we speak Tagalog or English.
That's
but the hybrid was very interesting to them. So the whole world knows about Singlish and the other Englishes, but Taglish has not quite gained recognition. But I think more and more people are interested in hearing it. So it will come from you. You will write the great.
Taglish is more of a real, parang almost bipolar exercise of the language, where you actually shift from fragments in English that you start with and use one word in Filipino to complete your thought. Whereas Singlish is more of parang naging official pidgin na. The English has been Singaporeized in a certain way in terms of certain nuances. It's not actually a back and forth between the two languages.
The two languages. It's its own kind of language already.
As I think in Filipino, in Taglish, it's really that back and forth. Or sometimes it becomes even multi-language spanning. Like if you have a Visayan who speaks in Filipino also well and in English and can put in the Cebuano, so pwedeng trilingual yung one sentence.
Do you have a plot in mind?
Yeah.
So what happens in the book?
This guy who's our supposed president now, that asshole, he's gonna disappear from this world.
In that book.
That's how it ends.
So it's like Inglourious Bastards, where people...
Something like that. It doesn't start with him. It starts with a lot of killings and a lot of sex and a lot of injustice and all that. But in the end, it's going to be a long book. In the end, the aliens come. And they
take him back to their planet.
And the North Korean...
So the alien's not the CIA. Yeah.
And Trump.
That's fantastic. I believe you should write this book, which will segue to my next question. Do you think it's important for a writer to be political?
No.
It's not.
I've never
But I find that you are very political, and you just recently...
It's only become so because I'm of a generation already where you tend to think of the future of the kids. Mm-hmm. When I was growing up, in my wild days, I was always proud to be apolitical. Mm-hmm. I thought that Eman Lacaba was my best bud for a couple of years or so, but the divergence was natural. Was very natural. Mm-hmm. We didn't argue about it, but I always thought that it was foolish of him to have fled to the mountains, or not fled, but gone up to the mountains. Although I respected and I admired the dedication and the passion, just different ways for different folks. Pero nangihinayang ako. Minsan nag-iinis pa nga ako. Galit ako, ba't siya,
You must have been in your early 20s.
Namatay siya ng napakaaga. Yeah. Imagine all the poetry that we could have had from him if he hadn't.
There's this huge mystique surrounding him, actually.
Well, that's the other thing, no? Na sometimes, when you die young and a martyr, it gets a little overblown, and it's that revolutionary side of him and the martyr side of him that gets played up. And what little the others know, open letters to artists, only one poem, But Eman can be seriously regarded as a terrific poet, with or without the revolutionary fervor, it's brilliant lines, brilliant poems. At his age, specifically. And in my case, well, it's more of a personal, I guess...
choice?
No, parang I was angry about what happened because nangihinayang ako sa talent niya. And
Did you write any poems about that?
Not about about his death, no. But nakakakuan.
It's funny because I read an essay by Sir Hemino Abad, Dr. Hemino Abad, tracing the evolution of Philippine writing in English. And the 80s, when a lot of political work was being done, it's just almost a footnote in this essay where he talks about the early 20s and 30s being highly romanticized English that we use, 40s and 50s, or the 50s, I think, to the 80s, where new criticism was being used. Yeah. And then the 80s, where a lot of political unrest was happening. It's just little more than a footnote. I guess glossing over the fact that maybe in times of political crisis, you're not really writing your best work.
Well,
or you're pushing something, you're irate, you're angry, you want change.
That's possible. Or it's part of your phase of feeding in on the environment and collecting all that. That's the other part of being a writer. It's the so-called research, the personal research, which will come out later. Like, it took some time before, say, Luwalhati Bautista published Dekada 70, It had to be ingested, siguro almost half a decade or after. And in fact, a lot of material in the martial law days still have to make it to the pages of creative literature. I'm sure there would be more pa, although tumatanda na the ones who are... I tried to work it in some parts of it in Great Philippine Jungle, but I didn't think I was political at the time. Except these days, it's parang too much na eh.
No, I find that even apolitical people or people who really did not want to engage are really coming out of the woodwork now and feel compelled.
Yeah, because it goes beyond... ideology or a political stance. I couldn't care less about what the strains of the left say against one another or against the ones on the right or what. I've always been liberal or more libertine, but it goes beyond that. It's a matter of decency already. But at some point, you have to be on the side of decency and rationality.
Right.
It's as simple as that. I wouldn't mind if he declares martial law, if he wants to, as long as you see that the country is going somewhere really positive. Not the way this generation now. Imagine all the kids watching TV and hearing him curse, and tokhang, EJK, the terms that are being, all of this will be the memory of that particular generation.
Absolutely.
From puberty up. And the challenges to young mothers now. Well, it's not a challenge for me anymore since my kids are grown up.
Right.
But I imagine, like you, how do you keep your son from imbibing some of this? And when you can't do it entirely, how do you explain it to him? Of course, you can always say, as a parent, all challenges are, boosts to a character. It's better than to have a very soft childhood for any kid. I always encourage my kids to eat mud, and climb trees.
Like literally eat mud or roll in the mud. And
knowing about how some people, which I found funny, would in turn restrict them from even watching TV,
That's too much.
The Waldorf school, etc. Why you're not immunizing your kid. You should immunize the kid early enough. Let them ride bikes and get scrapes, and bruises, scratches.
Or boost their immune systems with actual germs.
Yeah. Eat anything, or. Of course, sometimes, when they're 2 years old and they're trying to climb a high place, you get also kind of antsy.
But did you bring your young son to Iowa?
Yeah, see, Aya, he was 5 years old. And that was a funny story then. When his mother, Sylvia, and he, they came a month later. Again, luck of the draw. I was prepared to be alone 4 months. What happens was that my check from the State Department didn't come.
That's weird.
It didn't come my first week there. So Paul Engel lent me money, and some people were lending me money. And when it came, nadoble. So I was suddenly, flush. So that's when I asked Sylvia and to come over. That served as their fair money. It was unexpected. And in any case, one evening when we were, I think Sylvia and I had to watch a concert. And as we were used to in the Philippines, I was a bright kid, he was 5 years old. We left him in the apartment. Okay, you should milk.
It's a bit young.
You drink. Yeah, I wasn't. We were both not aware of the way. We got called in the next day because.
How did you find out, though?
He got bored.
Okay, so he went
So
out.
he went down from the 5th floor to the elevator and wandered around the lobby.
So, okay, that's just a room, right? It's not like it's a whole house that you're leaving to a child.
He wound up with the Nazareths.
Oh boy.
And then got parang.
You mean Elvis?
Yes, Peter and Mary and their daughters took care of him. Parang babysat for him until we got home.
It's a good legacy you left.
The next day, some social worker came knocking to give us a lecture and warn us of imprisonment. So, but
So what events in your life do you think made you a writer or a poet? Because you began as a poet before you became.
I was always a very energetic reader. I guess, yeah, the source of it would be, my dad had lots of Reader's Digest, that's mostly what he read, and that influenced me, I guess, when I was 7, 8, reading. And I remember in San Beda, in grade school, I was always frequenting the library already. I like to read. One major influence was a third-year high school literary teacher, Otto Jimenez, whom we all remember. He became part of the Light a Fire movement, but that was when I didn't associate with him anymore. But he struck a spark. The way he taught English literature, third year high, so I was about 13, 14. So impressed that I actually wrote a limerick. I was 14, yeah. And
you still remember the limerick?
No, thankfully. Because when I showed it to him, he called me to the faculty room and said, well, it's not quite a poem. I'll try to teach you real poetry sometime. Never did. But he was our idol, the ones, the scholars in class. We idolize him. The way he taught the language, composition, and literature. And since then, 14, 15, the break between high school and UP, I spent the whole summer reading magazines, getting drunk with Ding Noliedo's prose. And then, of course, Nico Kane came, Garcia Villa. And that was when I was transitioning to UP. So those were the major influences,
and what influences they were?
Nick and Villa. And Noliedo, some Kirima Polotan. But at that time, I tended to be swayed more by very lyrical language rather than the rational kind of prose or almost antiseptic. Or like Kirima was good, but her language doesn't soar the way Noliedo or Villa or Joaquin would. So those were the ones whose writings I gravitated to. And as a counterpart for the States, for the American writing, of course, it was E. E. Cummings, well before Eliot and the rest. It's not until later that you begin to appreciate the depth of Wallace Stevens and ganyan. I was so grown up now when I started appreciating Stevens. At first blow, it's really the
language,
lyricism and romanticism of Cummings. And even in terms of prose, again, it's the kind of fireworks style I can recall now.
Do you find that these genres that you write in all inform each other? I have a friend who became an essayist, but she said that it was really poetry, because she started out as a poet, that shaped her consciousness and really informed writing in that new genre. Do you think that your early training informs the other genres you write in?
I can't quite say the same, because to me, poetry has always been a bit separate from the rest.
Is it the highest form?
It has its own. It's the one that aspires most to music, so parang it's a kind of a monkhood when you enter it.
I agree.
Very distilled. So I'd say it's the farthest genre from like fiction and creative non-writing.
That's what some people we know do, creative non-writing.
Pareho na rin yan Or journalism, they're easy to merge, or parajournalism. But everything else is prose. Maybe the closest to poetry would be like writing a screenplay, which again I've also had experience with. So that all of that inform the entire corpus or matrix of writing. Being a screenplay writer helps a lot. I've always thought for the writer, the premium talaga is imagination more than intelligence or rationality or any correct moral or political or religious stance. It's really the imagination. Someone with more imagination can eventually find a way to craft the language that she or he uses, whereas the one was already, initially gifted, say, with some language, but if the imagination is dull, or the kind of experience that the writer goes through has not been much, that everything is vicarious, and he or she doesn't have that much of a rich imagination to begin with, then the materials that she or he are open to are very
limited.
Very limited.
If people could introduce you as one type of writer, what would it be? Because, for instance, in my case, I'm always introduced as a poet. First and foremost, what would you want to be known as?
I guess the poet thing still precedes the others, because for one thing, my fiction has not been that prodigious. Especially like I envy Sarge and Dean and Charlson, that they continue to, although not as often as before, do short fiction. I'd like to go back to short fiction one of these days. I haven't done many since over 2 decades ago, because my mind is in the novel. But then, with only 3 novels, that's not much. No? So parang it's still the poetry that, and then the rest of it, of course, is biographical writing, and those are commissioned works already. So parang I'd like to catch up with the repute for poetry in terms of the fiction, or also getting back to screenplay writing, which I used to enjoy.
Which is actually making. I mean, I've heard it. Somebody from not just one person, but from multiple sources, that literature is actually dead in our country.
No.
There are 2 genres that proceed from literature, or that really reach out a wider audience more than traditional literature does, and it's actually from Dean Alfar. YA, young adult fiction, and
still
film.
Literature.
And film.
No,
so they
when
think
you talk
that
of young adult, it's just that there's more of a crowd potential.
Right.
Because they're the ones who are undergoing, college education. So, they can read. Although a whole lot of them are also pulled away by social media. And the fact that when you say YA kasi, that's just like saying you can almost compare it to romantic novels na are being read by our domestics abroad. Actually, they outsell YA. So it's a kind of literature. But then, as for film, yes, it's a good genre. The problem lang is it's one of collaboration. So sometimes a screenwriter's work is limited, or has certain boundaries where, of course, the director still calls the shots. It would be nice to be a writer-director, of course, yung auteur type. But some collaborations between writer and director worked well. Like Pete's work for Dino Broca, Mike De Leon, Joey Reyes for Peke. Pwedeng ano.
Why do you think poets or writers, poets or literary writers kind of find their way to writing screenplays? Or why are they good at it?
Screenplays kasi involve dialogue. It's not just exposition. So it's not your usual narrative arc like in fiction. In fact, sometimes the dialogue, of course, in films would be more important, I think, than exposition. Except that the dialogue in screenplays, in film, also has to advance the story, apart from expanding or fleshing up the character and making each character distinct.
It has to move the narrative along.
By the very way the dialogue is conducted, the kind of speech patterns, well, unless, if you're gonna look at TV fare, everyone talks the same way, but a good scriptwriter can assign each character her own kind of speech pattern or diction or manner of speaking.
And in that way, you can already place who the character is, where he's from.
Yeah, sometimes very minimal dialogue. Okay, magtataas ako ng bangko ng konti, no? My favorite line that I did for Boatman ni Ticoy Aguiluz, no? And it became cult classic in a sense, especially the scene where Freddy Salanga was the pimp.
Okay.
I gave him that line when he's addressing Ronnie Lazaro na, ibaba ang lonta, ipakita ang ari. To me, that's poetry. It's almost haiku-like. But it was very serviceable in that context. But would someone really say that way? I think so.
Yeah.
A Manileño would say it that way, would say something that way. Someone who's, curt and si Freddy Panman, corpulent. It's so bagay, when he says, baba ang lonta, ipakita ang ari. And people remember that line. Yeah. So I'm so proud of that line.
Yeah.
So it doesn't have to be long monologues. And my pet peeve all these years, and I'm glad that finally it's seeing a certain death, but not quite as fast as I would. The use of a particular line. If you were to review the last 1,000 Filipino films, 990 would have this line. Ano ang ibig mong sabihin?
What's wrong with that?
It's terribly wrong. Nobody says it in real life. I've never heard
I've said it.
I've never heard it never heard anyone
But we say, what do you mean? In English, diba? So somebody says, what do you mean?
Ano ulit?
There.
Ano ibig mong sabihin?
I've said it.
And some scriptwriters have it 3 or 4 times in a movie, And again, it falls back on, it's an advertising.
Why does it feel false to you?
It's
like My Brother, My Executioner in the geographic center of a very famous novel, right? And people say, am I allowed to say this? Am I allowed to say this?
What, yeah.
You open a book and say, nobody talks like this, right? See, Greg Brillantes looked at a novel in the geographic part of the book. The title of the novel is used as dialogue. And he says, no, nobody talks like this.
Someone said.
I can't say, I can't reveal the book because, so
what was used exactly?
I'll tell you later.
Okay.
But he said nobody talks like this. So the dialogue was lifted from the title, which the titles are purposely poetic, right? So somebody says it in the book, and then Greg Brillantes was like, but nobody talks like that.
Well,
so it's like, anong ibig mo sabihin, right?
That's
a
legitimate gripe,
Yeah.
Ed Tempo said the same thing of an early short story by my good friend Willie Sanchez. Where the main character was a maid. Of course, the story is in English, so that's one difficulty already. How to.
So the maid was speaking in English.
Yes, exactly, and she was saying, "Oh, black butterfly," or something like that.
So
but it's not so much the dialogue itself, but the whole scene, parang. I agree. It's a bit unrealistic, There are ways to pull the trick when you're writing fiction in English. It depends, of course, on the environment and the setting, the world building. Of course, it's easiest if the family is in Forbes, and the dialogue flows easily. But when it's pedestrian or about prose, there is still a way of rendering the dialogue it's almost like stage English.
Yeah. Do you think that's still being done now by Filipino novelists?
I haven't read novels recently. No.
What do you think of in terms of language used in novels? Because I really want to read your novel about
yun nga, dapat Taglish na.
Dapat Taglish. We still italicize Tagalog words in novels. I don't think, let's say, Jung Palahiri does that.
Well, on the other hand, like Jessica Hagedorn had agreed with her editors to have all her Filipino terms non-italics na.
Okay.
But I'm not quite sold with the idea.
Okay.
Because it just calls attention to itself as well, even if it's in non-italics. I can accept that. It's not exactly Hebrew. You know, if you're in New York, you know it's chutzpah and bar mitzvah. They don't have to be italicized. No? But whenever Jessica's characters launch into some Tagalog, and it's that, parang, you know, the universal audience or the non-Filipino audience would just parang look for a footnote or look for a glossary. Calls attention to itself. It actually breaks up the flow of the. So I'm still for italicizing, and in a way, there are ways of working it in also within the narrative arc. Now, how to make some terms contextually appreciated. You know, like if you keep using bayanihan or something, or kumare, kumpare in your, you know,
basic
the reader
terms.
will get it.
Basic terms, but not full-on dialogue.
Yes.
A lot of younger Filipino writers really gained from your mentorship over the years and have actually made good careers after, you know, doing the usual route of workshops, winning awards. But through it all, and I can speak from personal experience, you're really like the literary father of so many younger writers today. Was that always in you? Did you always feel like you had to mentor younger generations?
I think it's just part of sowing the seeds.
The wild oats.
Wild oats.
So do you think that...
It's all part of... When you go through your own mentorship program, no, parang it informs you on how you will do it yourself eventually. I was lucky from the beginning. My mentors were always generous and Francis Eliana, Virgin Moreno. They became very, very close. I always became close to them. And then eventually when it was the Tempos, and I became part of the Cineman Mafia, ganyan. Again, it was the luck of being with people, even the early mentors then, Eric Torres, Orlando Tino, you know, they were generous people. They were not the sort, they were not the cranky type that says, go and tan kamote instead. So we learned that way, you know. And also lucky that my co-panelists like Jimmy Abad, you know, Marcia Vasco, try to encourage more than anything. So parang you can't pull off an arrogant stance. I'm already basically an arrogant person to begin with. No? So I try to cut off that arrogance when I come into the workshop mode or classroom mode. No? You know that young people really need encouragement more than anything. And of course, you just try to apply some learning or some things, you know, maybe some things they haven't read or some viewpoints they haven't been familiar with. You know, try to expand their knowledge, but more of encourage, you know. Yun. It's good to hear. Again, but it's a matter of luck also.
Yeah.
Being part of the panel of the Dumaguete workshop, because it really makes a lot of writers. You're lucky, you know, with every batch, there will always be 2 or 3 that will stick to writing and gain you know, professional names. You know? My other venue has been Ateneo. So it's also a matter of being lucky. I guess if it's, I won't name any other institution, but if it was something else, it might not have been the same.
Right.
Baka nandun na eh, yung chamba lang.
So when the student is ready, the teacher will come.
It also helps. So in my case, no, I have a way of getting somehow into parang a certain center of the, or vortex of things na my own personal network is quite expanded. No? So I have friends from high places as well as down in the gutter. No? So more opportunities come my way in, like helping out people like Joel Toledo, for instance, with his reading sessions in Magnet, or being friends with Rock Dillon, ganyan, to start out the readings there, or starting out Caracoa by being friends with, well, someone who eventually bankrolled it, Michael Adams and Agnes Arellano. I'm in that position, you know. I'm a kind of a social butterfly also, and because of my commitments, my professional commitments, I get to meet many people, and it's just a matter of parang harnessing that potential, no? The wind farm, the solar farm, and telling poets. Like in this last case, the matter of Bloodlust, the anthology of protest poetry.
By Bloodlust.
I had it in mind since early last year when all this indecency in the administration was surfacing and all the killings, you know. And I could sense that it wasn't just me. And true enough, Ian Casocot of Dumaguete was already compiling his own digital anthology in the Kill List Chronicles. So, you know, poets work along the same vein. You know?
Yes.
So it's just a matter of getting it together. I didn't know who was going to finance it. I just knew it can't just be digital. It has to be a book. So I asked for Ian's help, and then Jimmy, and true enough, while I was just about to finish the anthology, an angel came and provided the funding.
It's a book that had to be read.
You know, parang, I have that faith and trust and belief na something will happen. Ganyan. Basta, I'm not going to start the book only when there's funding already. You know? I'd lose months. You know? You get the feeling that it's time to collect it now. And true enough, just as Jimmy and I put an end to the submissions, the money came. So things happen. Things happen. Even if poetry is like a mouth.
How is poetry like a mouth?
In the valley of its saying,
so you belong to a very, very important group of writers writing in English, the Filipino writers writing in English, PLAC, leaving behind it a great legacy of canonical texts that we read in anthologies and that we learn in school. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? Why was it founded, and who were the members? I know who they are.
Yeah.
But if you could talk a little bit about
it. I think, personally, I find it as part of my strokes of luck or fortuitous circumstances that have always had me associating with either very generous mentors or contemporaries and friends, or who became friends that were really nice people, apart from being very talented. No? PLAC started when Cirilo got together with Jimmy Abad, and then me, Freddy Salanga, and Ricky de Ungra. And he suggested, I think it was either Cirilo's or Jimmy's idea, to formally organize a group. So we came up with the name Philippine Literary Arts Council. The main purpose then was to try to organize what eventually became what we called a national reading circuit. It was a matter of bringing our poems to an audience. And I think the first opportunity came when we were invited by the Paco Park Program Presents to come up with an evening of readings of our poems. I think at Paco Park, if I recall right, si Boots Anson Roa read with us, Lauren Legarda, who was still studying in UP, Joy Virata, and then some musicians from the UP music department. So that was a start. And then we began to read in academic institutions. And then we got lucky with Karakoa. But preceding Karakoa was an important anthology of political poems, which was titled In Memoriam. That was right after the assassination of Benigno Aquino, 1983. PLAC was formed in 1981, and it's Ricky who reminds us every year when the anniversary is. It falls on September 8th, parang Mother Mary Day then. And I always forget that a week later is his birthday. So it's just a way of alerting
reminding
me. But this year, I missed out again. I was a week late. Any case, that was 81 nga. So by 83, when Ninoy was assassinated, and that was funded by the then UP President Emmanuel Soriano.
I see.
Who happened to be a friend of Jimmy Abad. So that provided the funding. It was in yellow. We were all Dilawan, it was in yellow. I think we had 2,000 copies, And this we did, despite the fact that 4 of us, with the exception of Jimmy, were somehow associated with a government think tank, under Adrian Cristobal. And as a result of the publication of that book, In Memoriam, about the assassination, all 4 of us got fired from that state agency. Of course, it was Cirilo who suffered most because he had a real regular job. See, Freddie and I, all we did was really write messages and edit stuff. And Ricky and I were doing a good thing with a literary magazine that came out for about a year called Jose. It's become a collector's item. Ganda yan, yung Jose, quarterly.
Why Jose? After Jose Rizal?
Jose Rizal, Jose Batute, Jose Garcia Villa, all the Joses.
All the Joses.
Kaya we imagined then that parang in place of, say, Gat, people will say na, to greet another writer, Jose. And we had great artworks, so Danny Dalena did the cover, ganyan. Again, because of my association with Dumaguete and Cebu, that I could get from writer friends from Mindanao and the Visayas, easy. That's part of the editorship. Ganyan. So Ricky and I were so happy in doing that book. Anyway, yun nga, isang taon lang, natanggal kami lahat. And then PLAC went on, the Philippine Literary Arts Council, to start our own journal in Karakoa.
How long were these? Was this journal being produced?
I think it's still reputed to be the longest running literary journal in this part of the world, not even just the Philippines. I forget now who funded our first issue, but after the first 2, my friends Michael Adams and Agnes Adeliano stepped in and actually provided official funding. So we were really regular as a quarterly. And that went on to the 20th or so volume, and then nawala na that funding, and parang it became special issues. There was an environmental issue, there was an anniversary issue. It went on for about 29 or 30
issues.
Up to 29 yata or 30.
Maybe it's time to...
The last one was edited actually by the younger group na, by sila Joel.
2001. We actually co-edited it.
Was that 2001?
Parang 2001 or... no. Sorry, later. About 2004 or 2000.
Maybe. And there was talk again recently of reviving.
I think it's time. I mean, if it was political unrest that brought about the journal, then it's actually a good time to revive it.
Yeah.
Kahit one more issue.
Yeah, it might be the 30th issue.
The 30th issue.
Yeah.
A good round number.
Yeah. I just hope somebody writes 30 soon.
We'll write 30 soon.
And it doesn't have to be martyrdom or assassination this time around.
We can wait until a gentler administration.
But viva Plac! Viva Plac! Ah! Okay, might as well take this opportunity. One development that I've seen, unfortunately, happening in the literary scene, I guess it just predated the upsurge of trolldom in the political scene. But you know, in all the decades that I went through, you know, from being a teenager in UP, I never joined the UP Writers Club, but I knew about them. Hearing about the Veronicans, you know, that group, or yung, what's the other group, nila Adrian, you know, there have always been groups, you know. Most groups are supportive of the younger people, which we've also exercised. But it's only been in the past decade that there's this fringe activity going on among a certain set of writers who seem to have these false notions about, you know, establishment names, canonical works, so-called. You know, I can understand parang frustration in wanting to join a club or something. Nobody's impeding anyone from joining in. In fact, the arms have always been open in welcome embrace, no? In all the venues possible, like Magnet, you know. But some of the people in this fringe group, you know, they actually take advantage of being part of it for a while, only to turn back and dismiss it and criticize it, you know. Not just Magnet, but even the whole Siliman experience that they don't know anything about. There's this ageism involved. There's this hate for so-called geriatrics. There's this thinking that there's a mafia. The Plac, I mention this because Plac has always been thought of by those who don't know any better as a literary mafia. And the fact that I and Jimmy and Ricky Guinan often figure in judges' panels, whether it's for the Palanca or a graphic, marks me out in particular, you know, as pamafioso. When they don't know any better. You know, in the last Nick Joaquin Literary Awards, you know, as evidenced by Alma, Anona Scarpio, she actually took a video of the deliberations, which proves that how transparent it can be. We never knew anyone, you know, everyone was anonymous. And we judged fairly and squarely, you know. People still think, nah, like you yourself, you know, you've won certain prizes. They think you only do so because of friendship or patronage by some godfathers like us.
But I've always submitted anonymously.
Yun nga eh. It's so, it's so, you know, I praised, actually, the works of one of these people in that group, no? And a few of them I know, I used to know, or a couple have been my students, and they've been promising. But, it's a syndrome, eh, na, I guess it was just coming, you know, parang, but it saddens us among the older group that, you know, the literary family has to be rent pa, parang ganon, divided. Not really division, because hardly anyone naman listens to them. Sila lang, sa own echo chamber, no? But, you know, like we've always had umpil and pen. Magkalaban yan dati. Si Frankie and Adrian didn't speak to each other before. Until Adrian was near the last leg, his last legs na. No? But there was a bifurcation dati between Tagalog writers and English writers. No? But this disappeared in the 80s na rin siguro, ganyan. It helped that I also got associated with Umpil, and we were drinking with one another. Dati kasi parang bangayan eh, na parang the Philippine writers were saying the death knell of English, because of nationalism. It hasn't happened. Both are actually supportive of one another, and it has remained so. No? And the same with Umpil and Pen. Some people are members of both. No? Karina, Sir Charles, ganyan. Pwede naman magtulungan eh. But this fringe group nga, I don't know why they're so bent on bad-mouthing the so-called establishment guys or writers, When, if they really look at it very soberly, they should be appreciative, not of my efforts or anyone else's, but everything that has come before them, There's a tradition. The torch is passed. People try to help the other ford the stream or the river. No sense in parang slapping away the hand of friendship or ganyan. Especially since most of their charges nga are, again, based on false news or false perceptions. That's why it struck me recently, parang they were even antedating the trolls, that kind of activity. Totally counterproductive. Anyway, I hope it's just a matter of a generational glitch, So I am hoping that in the next generation, it will be back to being a homogeneous, wholesome environment, Literature has always been so. Unlike, say, theater, madaming kati dyan, nag-aaway-aaway yan. Film, the way it is now, they're very, very supportive of one another. Even music. Ang konti-konti natin eh. So, anyway, sayang lang.
We'll see what the next generation brings.
Yeah, I hope so. And some other group can take over what I wouldn't say started, what we tried to generate in the time that we were existing and we were thriving. But after a while, syempre, kanya-kanya na rin. So, we let go of the organization. It does not exist anymore. The friendships still do.
I agree.
That's it.
I'm very glad that this interview happened. I'm very glad I got the interview.
Thank you. Thanks, Mugi.
And we'll stop now. And good to see you.
Salamat then. Dream of knives. Last night I dreamt of a knife I had bought for my son. Of rare design, it went cheaply for its worth. Short dagger with fancily rounded pommel, and a wooden sheath which miraculously revealed other miniature blades. Oh, how pleased he would be upon my return from this journey, I thought. What rapture will surely adorn his 10-year princeling's face when he draws the gift the first time. What quivering pleasure will most certainly be unleashed. When I woke, there was no return, no journey, no gift, and no son beside me. Where do I search for this knife then? And when do I begin to draw happiness from reality? And why do I bleed so from such sharp points of dreams?